Hey guys, welcome back to another true crime episode of Cryptids and Cases. This episode is getting your way a little later than planned. I missed a few weeks because I was out of state for a doctor's appointment. Then I could just not get it together enough to sit down and write and plan an episode. I won't go into detail, but I do have some chronic illnesses, two of which aren't being treated right now because none of the medication really works. I don't say that to be like, hey, pity me, but I do want to put an explanation out there for delayed episodes. I'll always do my best to adhere to my upload schedule, but for now, while I'm not medicated due to a few things, there might be one here and there that's late. That won't always be the case, but it is for right now. I'd just rather not upload an episode than give you guys something half baked because I wasn't feeling well. I tried that with the Mothman episode, and while I've been blessed to get compliments on it, I just wasn't feeling great, and I can tell in the quality of the episode and just how I sounded. So, lesson learned. I am a little bummed just because I feel like October is prime spooky season, and my podcast can be spooky. And I was really hoping to do like an episode a week for October just to really stick with the season, and that just didn't happen. So I'm hoping October was just kind of a health fluke and we can proceed as normal from here on out. Now, getting down to our case. With this case, I really wanted to bring to attention the missing and murdered Indigenous women's movement that strives to bring attention to the alarming rate of Indigenous women and girls that are missing, abducted, and murdered. I feel like it's just not talked about enough in the true crime world, at least where I listen. And it's such an important cause. Just to stress how dire the situation is, the murder rate is 10 times higher than the national average for women living on reservations, and murder is the third leading cause of death for Native women. I find that to just be mind-boggling, just to know that murder is the third leading cause for a group of people just turns my stomach. You expect it to be maybe cancer or heart attack or some sort of more common medical situation, not murder. I'm going to read a few quotes that I've taken from BIA.gov to stress how dire the situation is because they say it better than I can. Quote, for decades, Native American and Alaska Native communities have struggled with high rates of assault, abduction, and murder of tribal members. Community advocates describe the crisis as a legacy of generations of government policies of forced removal, land seizures, and violence inflicted on Native peoples. A 2016 study by the National Institute of Justice found that more than 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaska Native women, which is 84.3%, have experienced violence in their lifetime, including 56.1% who have experienced sexual violence. Overall, more than 1.5 million American Indian and Alaska Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, non-Hispanic American Indian and Alaska Native females experienced the second highest rate of homicide in 2020. Additionally, in 2020, homicide was in the top 10 leading causes of death for American Indian and Alaska Native females aged 1 to 45. It's not just women. American Indian and Alaskan Native males have the second highest rate of homicide compared with males in all other racial and ethnic groups. Homicide was in the top 10 leading causes of death for males 1 to 54 years old in the year 2020. Close quote. Moving on to nativehope.org, they say, quote, in fact, 82% of Indigenous men are victims of violence in their lifetime, and Native children are more likely to experience trauma and abuse than their non-Native peers. When educating yourself about the struggles of Native Americans, it's important to recognize and remember all victims of these crimes. Close quote. They go on to say, quote, the National Crime Information Center reports that in 2016, there were 5,712 reports of missing American Indian and Alaska Native women and girls, though the U.S. Department of Justice's Federal Missing Persons Database, NAMUS, only logged 116 cases, close quote. These staggering rates for violence, abuse, and missing individuals in the indigenous community has always just made me really sick. It's the discrimination, the lack of thorough investigating, the lack of reporting, the lack of caring due to stereotyping, the lack of resources given to the communities that need it, the way that media just doesn't report on these cases like they do with cases of others. I just can't stomach it. I think it's super important to discuss this topic and bring awareness to it and speak up for those who were silenced. If you'd like to do more research into the topic or the movement, I recommend nativehope.org. It lays statistics out really clearly and has a lot of educational resources as well as ways you can help the cause. They've got some really good and informative videos, as well as a resources page that I found helpful. There's also a blog that you can subscribe to under their podcast tab. I really can't say anything better than the indigenous communities that have already spoken up, so I'll direct you to them and leave you with this really harrowing message. Something has to change, and I think the missing and murdered indigenous women's movement needs to be talked about a lot more. Thanks for hanging in with me through that. Those numbers and those things just aren't fun to talk about, but they are necessary. Now, let's get into the case. Shirley Soosay was a member of the Samson Cree Nation and was born in Alberta on a reserve that was originally called Masquachis, meaning Bare Hills in the Cree language, until 1891, where it was named by Cornelius Van Horn, who was president of the Canadian Pacific Railway. It was officially renamed Masquachis on January 1st, 2014, when the name was reclaimed. Just a bit of lore there. Shirley Soosay was described as being free-spirited, joyous, and curious. Violet Soosay Wolf, her niece, reported that she, quote, was a free spirit who loved to laugh and cared deeply about her mother. She was always smiling, always curious about the world, close quote. Her childhood best friend, Flora Northwest, said that she remembers her friend as a soft-spoken, gentle soul who was hardworking and took care in her appearance. She never complained, and when they were alone together at the residential school, they would laugh and speak in Cree. When young, she attended Ermineskin Residential School. Now, I hope I'm saying that right. I tried to research into it, but I digress. Her experience at that school was far from pleasant, and both she and her best friend, Flora Northwest, mentioned being mistreated at that establishment. I did some researching into this particular residential school with very low hopes because residential schools are just terrible in general. If you aren't aware, residential schools were created mostly by Catholic and Christian founders as a way to assimilate indigenous peoples into Western culture. The goal of the school was to strip them of their culture, language, beliefs, practices, and ways of life, and instead instruct them on how to fit into the ideal Western society. Now, of course, I think this is appalling because having diversity is a beautiful thing, and being connected to someone's culture is so important. Can you imagine someone of a different belief shoving you into an institution, stripping you of all you believe and know and follow of your language, and then trying their hardest to mold you into what they think you should be and follow? Not to mention, you'd be punished if you don't adapt to their language and belief system and change yourself completely. I can't fathom that. To know that so many lost touch with their culture because of these residential schools just breaks my heart. If you assumed that mistreatment and abuse was rampant in these schools, you'd be right about that too. Ermineskin Residential School in particular was formed by Roman Catholic missionaries, and it was one of the largest residential schools in Canada. In its beginnings, according to globalnews.ca, quote, overcrowding and illnesses were problems in the school's early years. The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation has recorded the deaths of 15 students at the school during its operation. In 1903, 3 children died of tuberculosis, while a government survey in the 1920s concluded that 50% of the students were infected with the disease. Survivors from the school told the Truth and Reconciliation Commission they were physically abused for speaking their first language and for practicing their traditional ceremonies. One survivor said that she was victimized by staff and students. Close quote. Fortunately, the school closed in the early 1970s and the educational facilities were transferred to the Ermine-Skin Cree Nation. I also read that Pope Francis visited the school and offered apologies for how it was created and ran by the Catholic Church during its foundation, so I guess that's something. Attending this school brought challenges to Shirley Soosay and her friend Flora. At the school, they were taught tasks which included cleaning and waitressing, among other religious based and Western culture focused classes. Of their time at this school, Flora says, quote, Indigenous children that were taken away from their families and put into residential schools were forbidden to speak their language, and some were abused mentally, emotionally, physically, and sexually. It was so painful. It just brings back my own childhood. It just brings me back to the cries at night, when we used to cry at night. It had a lot of impact in my life. It still does. As I recover through my life's journey, there's always something that triggers, that brings me back to that child that was abused. How did these people get away with it? Why did they get away with it? Close quote. After years of enduring mistreatment at the residential school, both Flora and Shirley went back home to the reserve at the age of 16, where Shirley lived until her early 20s when she moved to Edmonton and worked at a catering business. Flora mentioned that both had voiced wanting to move away and work due to what they had learned in their residential school. She did this for some time until she moved again and went to Vancouver and took employment as a domestic worker, which is essentially someone who does household work for another person, such as cleaning, cooking, taking care of the children if there are any, and things like that. It's essentially a mashup of a maid and a nanny. While she worked in Vancouver, she would regularly send money back to her mother and never missed sending a birthday card back home when it was someone's birthday. Shirley Soosay at the time also had 2 children, both boys, who were unfortunately taken from her due to a false allegation by the children's vindictive father that she was unfit to raise them. The sons were taken from Shirley by the child welfare system. One son went into foster care and the other was adopted by a Caucasian family. It breaks my heart that they were separated. Shirley Soosay said that losing her children completely and thoroughly devastated her. Shortly after losing them, she turned to drugs and alcohol to cope with the loss, and as such, fell into addiction. Because of this addiction, she did then unfortunately lose her baby daughter. Shirley was seen in person for the last time at a funeral for her oldest brother in 1977, back home on the reserve. According to Violet Soosay Wolf, who again is Shirley's niece, she says, quote, she was not your regular addict. She didn't go out on the streets, close quote. She also noticed at the funeral that her aunt was meticulously groomed and put together. She just looked like she had it all together. She looked fine. She looked beautiful. One wouldn't know that she was really struggling with addiction. After her visit, Shirley's mother stressed how dangerous the world could be for Indigenous women, and she implored her to stay put in one place in case someone ever wanted to find her. Her niece recalls making the macabre comment that her aunt should get some specific tattoos, that way she could be identified if something happened to her. 2 years after her last in-person appearance with her family, letters, cards, and correspondence from Shirley stopped. Shirley's mother, Teresa, grew incredibly worried and begged her granddaughter, Violet Soosay Wolf, to go find her Aunt Shirley. The niece agreed, and she began to make regular 13-hour trips to Vancouver and Seattle, where her aunt had mentioned that she might visit, all to find her aunt, which I think is just so good of her. If I had the means, I would definitely do the same thing. So I think that's wonderful that she was making such a long journey and made up multiple times just to find her aunt. Through her searching, Violet even managed to find one of Shirley's sons through DNA testing and brought him back to live with her family on the reserve. Violet searched diligently for her aunt, along with a few other family members, such as Violet's sister, Belle. She searched for so many years through her adulthood and finally, in 2019, spoke at a women's conference of all of the exhaustive efforts she had put forth into finding her aunt, and that finally she needed to let go. Keep in mind that Shirley went missing in 1979. Her niece searched for her until 2019. Again, I just admire that dedication so much, and my heart is just so sad at how much love Shirley's family had for her to search for that long. I mean, that was like what, 40 years? Now, the really sad thing about this is that her niece and her family members had no idea that Shirley had moved to California for a brief period. For years and years, Shirley's niece had been searching not just the wrong cities, but the wrong states. Also, unbeknownst to her family, Shirley's body was found in an almond orchard in Kern County, near Bakersfield, California, on Tuesday, July 15th, 1980. She was found by workers in the orchard in the early morning hours, 13 rows deep inside of the orchard. She was wearing a pink blouse, blue jeans, and clean white shoes. She had been stabbed about 29 times, sexually assaulted, and beaten. However, tire tracks near her body with a lack of footprints informed that she was killed in a different location and then dumped in the orchard. Detectives at the scene believed the body to be Native American or Hispanic and around the ages of 30 to 40 years old. The body had two distinctive tattoos, one that had Shirley in a red heart with the words, "I love you" above it and "Seattle" below it. The second depicted a rose with the words, "Mother, I love you" written around it. It seemed that she had gotten distinctive tattoos like her niece had recommended, yet those two markings did not help in identifying her, even though law enforcement from both Los Angeles and Seattle went to multiple local tattoo parlors to see if any of the shops recognized the tattoos. A few Los Angeles shops reported that her tattoos were not in alignment with the styles that were commonly used and popular at the time. There was also a beer bottle next to her body. At her autopsy, it was determined that her blood alcohol levels were 0.3% and that she had only been deceased for about a day. In addition, there was also defensive wounds on her hands and arms. DNA was also collected from bodily fluids and material under her fingernails. Another attempt to identify her was made when a photo of her face was taken and shown to workers at the orchard. No one recognized her, though. Her fingerprints were also examined, but didn't turn up any matches. The autopsy reported that she had also been pregnant and given birth before and also had a rod in her left leg. With no leads, investigators issued a media release and urged locals to come forward if they knew anything. Unfortunately, no one came forward with plausible information, further signifying that the victim was probably not local to the area and hadn't been there longer than a few weeks. Left unidentified, the body was named the Kern County Jane Doe No. 5. Interestingly enough, 3 days later, another body was found in Los Angeles on a slope near a high school parking lot. The woman seemed to be between the ages of 25 to 30, was wearing a bloodied white shirt, red corduroy pants, and open-toed heels. A smearing of blood on the ground as well as tire tracks near her body suggested that she too was killed in a different location and then dumped. Just like the body found before her, there were signs of struggle in the form of bruises and marks on her arms, and she had also been stabbed multiple times. She had been found by maintenance workers at the school. Again, just like the body found before her, there didn't seem to be any leads on identifying the woman or the person responsible. One man came forward and said that he had seen someone matching her description hitchhiking, but nothing came from that tip. After a month of not being claimed and no answers coming forward, she was buried, her bloody clothes were kept for examination, and she was named the Jane Doe of Ventura County. At the time, these two cases also were not connected with each other. As I'm sure you can guess, I wouldn't be including this one if it wasn't connected, though. Unfortunately, Shirley's case went unsolved for a few decades. Eventually, in 2003, 23 years after her death, a cold case unit was deployed to once more try to identify the Kern County Jane Doe. They headed to Skid Row in Los Angeles due to the high level of Native Americans living there at the time, which is just really sad. It turned up no leads as no one was able to recognize her. Not really a shock considering we know that she wasn't in the area for very long. They also revisited the tattoo shops in the area to no avail. No hope would come for solving the case and identifying Shirley until 2008 when DNA found on her body matched Wilson Shuest, who was then in custody in California. I wish that this connection could have been discovered so much sooner, but back in 1979, 1980, when they were investigating her death, DNA screening and other methods used to solve murder cases just weren't technologically advanced enough. Wilson had moved to California after being discharged from the military for, quote, unsuitability. In 1977, he was arrested for abducting, strangling, and assaulting a woman who was able to escape. Eventually, he was sent to prison on a plea deal that dropped the rape charge against him. In June 1980, he was paroled despite a probation report noting he had no remorse and was extremely dangerous. Why was he paroled? Especially if he had no remorse and was marked dangerous. I don't know. This doesn't make sense to me. I think that's ridiculous, but I'm not a judge. I wasn't in the jury. I'm just a stressed out podcaster. Now, Wilson Shuest had said that the motivation behind his attacks were robbery, saying that he wanted to get a few dollars so that he could grab a drink. The sexual assaults were just, according to him, incidental. Now, I could really go into that because that just makes my skin crawl. That makes me so mad. I don't know, get a job, do a service, get your own money to get drinks, stop assaulting women. You just can't reason with crazy. So I just will end it there because that blows me away. Of course, after Wilson Shuest was released, he went right back to doing terrible things. Are we shocked? I'm not. In 1980, the same year that he was released on parole, he attacked a woman at knife point, and then a month later, abducted another woman, assaulted her, and robbed her. This is when I start to get even more heated because these two women could have been saved so much trauma and anguish if he had just been left in jail like he should have been. Like I said, I just don't get it. From here, you guessed it, I just get even more angry. He was sentenced to 12 years to life for those two crimes, but was paroled again in 2004. It was then rescinded, and then he said he could receive it a few years later. Again, why are we paroling this man? Why are we even discussing letting him out on parole? Why is that an option? Keep him in jail, but they let him out. It just baffles me. It absolutely baffles me. Eventually, DNA evidence showed that the bodily fluids collected from the assault of the Ventura County Jane Doe was that of Wilson Shuest. Ventura County cold case investigator Steve Rhodes had been researching the case of both Jane Does and firmly believed that Shuest was the killer of both of them. He compiled his evidence along with the DNA findings and requested an arrest warrant. Despite DNA evidence proving that Shuest had intercourse with the victim, the prosecutor rejected the case. It was claimed that despite DNA proving he had intercourse with one of the Jane Does, it didn't prove that he killed them. Steve Rhodes countered this. He pointed out in a PowerPoint that the fluids in the Ventura County Jane Doe were still pooled, meaning that she hadn't stood up afterwards. After this case was made, Deputy District Attorney John Barrick insisted that Wilson Shuest be prosecuted for killing both women. Barrick made a statement to A&E True Crime stating, quote, "Under the laws of murder, I don't have to prove their identity. I just have to prove that they're a human being. I thought it was worth the effort, because if we don't, then these women will never get the justice they deserve, even if we don't know their names. And there's a good possibility that Wilson is going to get out, and that is not a person who deserves to be out amongst law-abiding citizens." He goes on to say, Kern County didn't want to prosecute the case unless they knew the name of the victim. I was like, there's evidence, they're people, they're dead, let's go. Victims of these horrendous murders in the last moments of their lives suffered horribly. They deserve justice, even if we don't know who they are. Close quote. Honestly, bless this man, and I could not agree with him more. Despite being unidentified at the time, the two women deserved justice. Shuest, in my opinion, needed to atone for their deaths, and certainly needed to be back in jail. On September 23, 2015, Shoe West was brought back to Ventura County on a court order. He was arrested on September 30th and charged with 3 counts of murder, the deaths of the 2 Jane Does, and the death of the Jane Doe Ventura County's male fetus. Now, Steve Rhodes asked Shoe West what his motivations were with what he had done. Shoe West said that the motivations behind the sexual assaults were about control. It was about taking his anger towards his mother out on other women after he'd witnessed his mother fooling around with other men behind his father's back as a child. He said, quote, "It's about getting back at people for what was done to me." Close quote. I get being angry at your mother for cheating on your father. Totally understand that. Totally understandable. Take your frustrations out on your mother. Don't kill her. I'm not saying kill her, but maybe talk to your mother. Or if she had passed, why would you go to random women who had nothing to do with the situation that you were put under and take out your anger on them? Again, there's so much about him I just don't understand. And thank goodness, I guess. When Shoe West was questioned in particular about the 2 Jane Does, though, he said, "Not my DNA, I didn't do it." Shoe West was adamant that he had nothing to do with the Jane Does at all. He went on trial on May 14th, 2018 and pleaded not guilty. The 3 women who'd survived Shoe West's previous attack testified against him in court. A man who'd stayed with Shoe West as a teenager came forward and told the court that in 1980, Shoe West had confessed to killing a woman and dumping her body. On May 31st, 2018, just a few days after his trial, Shoe West was found guilty of murdering the 2 Jane Does, but was not convicted for the death of the fetus in the Jane Doe of Ventura County. On July 12, 2018, Shoe West received 2 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. Finally, it seemed that justice had been done. I just can't believe it took that long for that to happen.
Other news tonight. Nearly 10 years ago, the Sheriff's Department submitted a cold case to the Kern County Crime Lab, and it was a success. DNA recovered from the murder victim's body matched a convicted serial rapist. But what seemed a slam dunk was turned away by the district attorney's office because the victim had been a Jane Doe for decades. It wasn't until a few years ago, when another DNA match was made on a cold case in Ventura County, that investigators there realized their victim, murdered in July of 1980, was killed just days apart from the Kern County Jane Doe's murder. Ventura County decided to prosecute both cases, doubling their workload, but giving both victims a shot at justice. Nearly 40 years after the murders, the victims got just that.
Typically at a sentencing hearing, we hear from the victims' loved ones about the impact their loss has had on them. It's a reminder of why a sense of closure and justice is so important. But today, we didn't have that. Both murder victims are still unidentified, their family unable to mourn their loss. Yet, it still was very emotional in the courtroom, as almost everyone there made it clear they're here for the victims and they've become their family. At 66 years old, it was unlikely Wilson Shoe West would ever get paroled from prison following his 2 murder convictions, but his public defender tried nonetheless to ask the judge for mercy. When Judge Ryan Wright had his chance to speak, he first and foremost commended the investigators involved in this case.
Detective Rhodes, Detective Evans, and the other officers who, when the rest of the community stayed tuned and forgotten about these victims, they did. It was a tremendous effort.
And to Shoe West,
and while I take no personal pleasure ever in saying a criminal defendant, I would tell them about taking a tremendous amount of professional satisfaction in telling you there will never be a parole board. Your last breath is going to be taken in state prison, right where you deserve to be, and it's going to be on my order.
And with that, Wilson Shoe West was escorted off, sentenced to life without the possibility of parole.
It took me a long time to process that and to realize they had no one.
It was very heartbreaking, and you felt like, is there anybody here in the world who cares or knows they should care?
But the jurors soon realized the Jane Does, one of whom was 4 months pregnant, weren't without people who care.
It kept sinking in deeper and deeper to me that I have to be their family. We have to be their family. We have to be their voice. and see this to the end. And that little baby would have been 38 years old this year.
Doing this trial was probably one of the most important things I've done in my life.
For prosecutor John Barrick, this outcome is satisfying, but he's still left with the frustration of Shue West refusing to help investigators finally identify the Jane Does.
I think this is the highlight of his life, and I think he gets some sort of sick pleasure out of knowing that we'll never be able to identify these women. I think he wants to hold on to that.
A thought that also torments investigator Steve Rhodes, yet doesn't deter him. When we first met Rhodes several months ago, he talked of retiring. Since then, an arrest has been made in the notorious Golden State Killer case. Rhodes played a key role in that investigation, and now Shue West is convicted and sentenced. While many others may feel their job would be done at this point, Rhodes is different.
And the job for this particular case involving Shue West is identifying these two young women. I really and truly feel that we need to send them home to their families. It's not over until I can find out who they are and send them home.
Steve Rhodes, though, wasn't content to just let things rest there. He wanted to uncover the identity of both women. He recalled how DNA evidence was used to find the identity of the victims that had been murdered by the Golden State Killer, whose case he actually had a hand in as well, and wanted to use those same methods. He enlisted the help of the same group who had a hand in solving the Golden State Killer cases, a group that was known as DDP, or DNA Doe Project. This group, made up completely of volunteers, uses genetic genealogy to identify Jane Does and John Does. In 2018, they began to dig into the cases of the two women. The Jane Doe of Ventura County, again, the one that was found by the high school parking lot, was identified as having a Mexican heritage, but the search didn't reveal any close relatives. They also found that the Jane Doe of Kern County, who we know was Shirley Soosay, was likely indigenous, and they traced her back to parents who were likely from Massachusetts, Alberta, Canada. Despite getting that close, with the lack of DNA profiles from indigenous peoples in the area, she could not be identified. A plea was sent out on Facebook urging the peoples from Massachusetts to take part in uploading their DNA profiles. This plea was seen by none other than Violet Soosay, who had been searching for her aunt, like we said, for decades. Violet sent in her DNA after seeing this post, and it was a match to the Jane Doe of Kern County. Finally, after almost 40 years, the Kern County Jane Doe was given a name: Shirley Soosay. Violet Soosay Wolf stated, "I went from, oh, joy, and then sorrow, anger, and a whole gamut of emotions. There are no words." Family members of Shirley Soosay worked together to have her remains exhumed from California and brought back home to the reserve. Due to complications surrounding COVID at the time, this was delayed until 2022, when she was finally returned home and laid to rest. Before she was exhumed, a small memorial service was held at the California cemetery where she had been buried as a Jane Doe. It was mostly attended by staff who worked at the cemetery and the coroner's office. The ceremony included traditional practices such as smudging, blessings performed by the Tule River tribe of California, and songs. At the wake, Violet was interviewed, and she had this to say.
Most of all today is relief that I'm able to ensure that the promise I made to my grandmother, who is the matriarch on my father's side, that to find her and to bring her home, this is the final step. Finding her was 2 years ago. Bringing her home is today. Today's that final step. It's no more not knowing. It's no more uncertainties. We are certain she's home now, and we are certain that we can visit her gravesite. Even though we know spiritually she's already in with Creator and all our ancestors, we know that. We lose a lot of our young men, our young women, our girls, our boys, adult men and women. Don't give up. Like, don't give up, because there is hope. If I can do it after 40 years, with today's technology, there's different mechanisms that can be utilized to find our loved ones. That's a message, like, don't give up.
After Shirley's case was reported on an episode of Cold Case Files, other Indigenous families with missing relatives reached out to Soosay's family with hopes that their cases would be solved too. In a way, her case gave them renewed hope. At the wake, Flora Northwest, Shirley's childhood friend, said people came to remember Shirley and honor her. But it was also about all missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, men, and boys. She says, "We're here for families still searching for their loved ones. The police need to do more work." Now, though this podcast episode didn't focus completely on the Ventura County Jane Doe, I tried to do some research to see if her identity had been uncovered as well. Though I searched and searched, I wasn't able to get very many leads or answers. I did find a website that had a few girls she could be and why that was the case, but other than that, I was drawing a lot of blanks. I do believe that her case is still being worked on, though. The only thing that I did find was that thanks to the DNA of her unborn son, they were able to locate his father. However, it seemed that he had never had a relationship with the woman. It was likely a hookup situation, and after so many decades, he could not recall her name or any other identifying things about her. The Ventura County Jane Doe, to this day, unfortunately, remains unidentified, and I can only hope that she is eventually given a name. It breaks my heart that there are so many missing and murdered Indigenous people out there, so many that are just Jane or John Does or haven't been found at all. I'll link a few resources on my social media pages when I announce the release of this episode. If anything can come out productively from Shirley's case and ensure that she did not die in vain, I think it would be advocating for those who are missing in her community and communities like hers, just like Violet said that she hoped would happen. No matter someone's background or race, missing persons and unidentified individuals deserve to have their cases worked on and resources poured into them. Steve Rhodes did an excellent job at being persistent and not giving up, and I hope that a lot of other investigators take his example and apply the same effort to those still waiting to be found or given a name. There are so many families out there who deserve closure and answers. I'm so grateful that Shirley was able to be returned home after so many years, and that her family's tireless searching was rewarded with answers and reunion, even if the reunion wasn't what they were hoping for. Thank you guys for tuning into this episode with me. I know that I usually do cold cases because I think that it's really important to get those stories out there. But I also thought it was really important to get Shirley's story out there, especially with all of the advocating work that Violet Soosay Wolf is doing after her disappearance. I also thought it would be nice to give you guys a case that has some closure. And though it was a really sad, unfortunate thing, it had something good come out of it. I know that only listening to and reporting on cold cases can just get really heavy and discouraging. So maybe this helped break that up a little bit. What did you guys think of the episode? What do you think of the case? Feel free to tell me all about it. I absolutely love hearing you guys. Every comment, every message, every email, they all matter so much. I am still waiting on family permissions for 2 cases that you guys have sent me that are current, recent, and ongoing. I really want to report on them, but since they are so fresh and new and not very well known, well documented, there's not been an A&E special on them. I just don't want to violate anyone by diving into the situation without getting some permission first. I also don't want to harass the families by asking them multiple times. Get ready for our next episode, which will be a cryptid episode, of course. I'm sure you get that pattern by now. Even though spooky season is coming to a close, I still feel like we could extend it a little bit and talk about some spooky stuff. Remember to keep an eye on my socials for updates. You can find the podcast page on Facebook and Instagram under Cryptids and Cases, and on Twitter/X under the name Cryptids, the letter N, Cases. All of the letters in that username are lowercase except for the N in Cryptids in Cases. I'm most active on my Facebook page, I will say, so if you have a comment or a question or a suggestion for a future topic, please reach out to me there or via our email, cryptidsandcases@gmail.com. If you could do me one last favor and rate this podcast on whatever platform you listen on, as well as follow, like, or download the episode and podcast, that helps me loads with the algorithm. All right, I will love you and leave you there. Can't wait to catch you on the next one. Bye, guys.